Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today we are resuming our series about the great political films. The second half of that series starts here. We're going to take it up to the present day, so there will be some more recent films to come. Things like There Will Be Blood, The Social Network, The Zone of Interest. We will come quite close to the present day. But I'm picking it up where I left it off in the 1960s. With one of the greatest ever films about political assassination, though it is about much, much more than that. I'm talking about Costa-Gavras' legendary film, Z. Z, and it is just the letter Z, it's not even spelt out Z-E-D, Z, came out in 1969, and in many ways it is the quintessential late 1960s film. It's about assassination, and this was the age of assassination in 1968. Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. It's about conspiracy and cover-up. It's about the Cold War. And it's also about street politics, street violence, student politics, and police brutality. This is 1969. 1968 was also the year of student uprisings around the world, most famously in France, Les Événements, in Paris, student uprising, police suppression, but in many, many other places too. 1968 was also the year of the brutal Democratic Party convention in Chicago. Images on TV of young people being beaten around the head by police were everywhere, and indeed of young people fighting back. This is a European film, but it is really informed by the spirit of 68, comes out in 69. But it's also a film that is clearly directly inspired by the last film I talked about in this series. So it does have a link back to the Battle of Algiers, partly because Z was shot in Algeria. That was the location that they used for this film. It's also a film that has all of its dialogue in French. Not all of the dialogue in the Battle of Algiers is French, but the vast majority of it is. The Battle of Algiers is partly a French film, and so is this one. Many of the actors in this movie are French, speaking French, and frankly, they look pretty French. It's got a French feel to it, this film, though Costa-Gavras was a Greek director. It's a film about real events like the Battle of Algiers, and it tries pretty faithfully to reconstruct those events. So it's a kind of reconstruction movie. It doesn't use newsreel or archive. This is all done for the movie. And unlike the Battle of Algiers, it doesn't really have a newsreel feel to it, but it certainly has a documentary feel to it. I think we might call it a docudrama today. And as one critic said of Z, sometimes the film feels like the director just happened to have a camera running as the action was taking place. It's quite haphazard. It's not particularly tightly edited, or at least it gives the appearance of not being tightly edited. I suspect it was very closely controlled, the edit. But it's got a kind of rambling quality to it. It's like you happen to be there as these events are unfolding, so it feels like you might be seeing them for what they are. And yet, it is also a very different film from the Battle of Algiers. It's not set in Algeria, so it's filmed in Algeria, but we're not meant to be looking at Algeria, unlike the Battle of Algiers, which is set in the places where the events it describes took place. In this film, Algeria stands in for Greece. We're not told at the beginning of the film where we are, so there isn't any background sketched out for this movie. But we know, and we are expected to know, that the place that we are dealing with here is Greece, which also makes it pretty odd that this film all happens in French, and indeed that some of the actors are French. It tells the story of the assassination of a real Greek politician. The assassination in question happened in 1963, so this is pre-68. It's that earlier year of assassination for most people. When they think of a political assassination in 1963, only one name comes to mind, John F. Kennedy. The assassination that this film is about took place exactly 6 months before JFK was shot. So JFK was shot on the 22nd of November, 1963. On the 22nd of May, 1963, a leading left-wing Greek politician and peace activist, a man called Grigoris Lambrakis, was murdered in public. He was beaten on the head and he died from the injuries, from the brain injuries that he suffered. And in Greece, certainly this was a convulsive event. It didn't have the same impact around the world. You don't hear people outside of Greece saying, do you remember where you were when Lambrakis was killed? But in Greece, it was convulsive. And it was a deeply symbolic assassination too. So this is a real man, a significant Greek political figure who died 6 years earlier. And in this film, he is not just played by a French actor, he's played by Yves Montand, who's about as French as you can get. Yves Montand, who had been discovered by Edith Piaf and who was the lover of Simone Signoret, and was a French singer, an actor. He looks French, he speaks French in this film. But we're meant to think that he is a real-life Greek politician, and everyone around him, though many of them look quite Greek, not all of them, but many of them, they're all speaking to him in French. So it's quite discombobulating. We know where we are, or at least we know where we're meant to be, and yet it's not as it seems. It's not like the Battle of Algiers, which could be documentary footage. This is clearly a highly artificial and stylized reconstruction of a real event. And that's what gives this film its unique quality. It is so realistic. It is so true, or tries at least to be so true, to the events that it describes and to this assassination and its aftermath. And yet at the same time, it is clearly a fiction. And that's what it's about in many ways. It's about the relationship between real events, what actually happened, and the fictions, the stories that we tell about them. Because in the end, this film is not just about what happened. It's about the contest to tell the story of what happened. And that becomes the reality too. So this is a film, I would say much more than the Battle of Algiers, about the relationship between reality and appearance, deception. It is a conspiracy film. It's about the uncovering of a conspiracy, the conspiracy that lay behind this assassination. But it's also a film about not trusting appearances, not being sure what it is that you see and what it means to try and uncover the reality behind the appearance, but also all of the ways in which the appearance obscures the reality. And I think what makes this such a great political film is that it offers three different accounts of politics in sequence, three visions of how politics works. In the first third of the film, you get one vision. In the next two-thirds or a little bit less, you get the second vision. And then right at the end, you get a third version, a third picture of how politics really works. And as I was watching it, I found myself thinking, if you could link these three together, if you could work out as the viewer what connects the first version and the second version and the third version, you would kind of have the answer to the mystery of politics. It feels like a film that is offering you some kind of vision of the whole thing. I'm not sure in the end you do get to understand how the three connect. I'm going to try and connect them here. I'm not sure I've got it, but it is tantalizing. It feels like a very complete account of politics, not just of violent politics or democratic politics, but of politics, of that business of power, political power, and all it means in its different guises, with the emphasis on the guises and what lies behind the mask. So what's the first vision of politics that we're given in Zed? I would say the first third, roughly, maybe a quarter, a third of the film, which leads up to the assassination of Lambrakis, of Yves Montand, is a version of politics which treats it as a kind of physical contest to occupy physical space. It's about force and violence. It's a very material view of politics in the sense that it's a materialist account of human beings as bodies occupying space. And the contest, the basic contest of politics, is to hold the line, to occupy the space that the other people want to occupy and to keep them away, keep them out. So it's about clashes, violent street clashes. It's about the politics that takes place on the street. It's also about occupying rooms, literally rooms, being in the place. And it implies that a large part of politics is the ability to hold your ground when other people are trying to dislodge you. And that this was the politics in many ways of the late 1960s. So that might make it sound like it's saying all politics is street politics, All Politics is a version of the students against the pigs, or however they would have put it in the late 60s. But actually, All Politics isn't that, but All Politics is in part about the occupation of space. All competitions for power, at some level, require people to hold a particular space. Even the occupation of an office, which is both a metaphor and a literal statement of what it is to have power. In British politics, the competition is to sit on the benches of the government side of the House of Commons. The House of Commons is a very, very physical space. And a lot of the competition is conditioned by that space. One group of people are trying to dislodge the other group of people from the benches. They're not allowed to do it by getting up and physically dragging them off the benches. In some parliaments, that sometimes happens. In the House of Commons, it's incredibly rare for it to get physical in that sense, incredibly rare. But that feeling that what's going on here is one group of people are squatting in a place that another group of people want to hoik them off of, that is politics. One of the films I talked about earlier in this series, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the pivotal moment in that film is when Jefferson Smith stands in the floor of the United States Senate, in the well of the Senate, and he holds his ground. He stands up, he catches the eye of the man who chooses, who speaks and who doesn't speak, and he refuses to back down, to stand down, to sit down, and it's very physical. He then has to carry on standing for 24 hours without seemingly eating, drinking, or going to the toilet. It's a physical struggle to occupy space. In this film, it's not a parliamentary version of that. It's not happening in a legislature. It is happening both out on the street and in rooms. So the film begins in a scene in a very boring, bureaucratic-looking room, sort of room in which meetings happen all over the world all the time. Boring meetings, and it looks like a very boring meeting. It's a man giving a lecture about agriculture and mildew and how to protect crops from corruption and decay. A scientist is talking to a group of people who look frankly bored out of their minds about the need to improve certain agricultural techniques. What's weird about this, although it's clear that the people in the meeting are sort of trapped. They are trapped in the room. Everyone knows that experience. That's not just politics, that's life. Being trapped in the meeting and wishing you were somewhere else. These people look like that. Some of them are doodling, some of them are asleep, but they clearly aren't allowed to leave until this talk is over. And what's weird about it is the person giving the talk looks like an incredibly ordinary functionary, but the people listening to the talk are wearing military uniform. So they're trapped, but they are being forced to listen to a talk by someone that you assume they wouldn't normally give the time of day to. And then it becomes clear that what's going on is that that talk is just being used as the pretext for a wider kind of talk about, as we're now to understand, though it hasn't been explained to us, but anyone watching the film at the time would know where we are and what we're talking about. Greek politics. The men in the room are the military who are behind the throne and the government. They are not officially in charge, but these are clearly the powers in the state. These are the generals. These are the colonels. These are the men who are calling the shots. And one of their number then gives his version of that little talk, which is politics is about keeping out the mildew, keeping out the corruption, that the young of Greece are being corrupted. The young of this country are being corrupted by foreign ideas in the same way that a crop might fail. And the job of the state is to keep them whole, keep them pure, keep the nation safe by keeping out corruption. That's who these people are. And it then becomes an argument about another room, because it becomes clear that one of the things they're going to have to decide about is a request that they've had from a leading left-wing and peace activist Greek politician, that is Lambrakis, or a version of Lambrakis, to give a talk. He wants to give a talk. Lambrakis was a member of parliament. He was a member of the broad United Left Front. He was, this is 1962-63, he was a leading campaigner for this new international movement, which was for nuclear disarmament. So he's pushing very hard for Greece to not be involved at the front line of the Cold War, not to be occupied in particular by American military force. And in the movie, a politician based on this character wants to give a talk, and he wants to find a room in which to give a talk. They are clear that he's very popular, increasingly popular. He seems to be someone who may well win in unspecified elections that are coming up. They don't want this man to talk. They would like to suppress his message. His message is what they consider the corruption of the young. And at the same time, one of these military men says, but of course we are a democracy. This is not a military dictatorship. We are not actually in charge. We are merely the servants of the people. We are a democracy. So we need to be careful here that it doesn't look like we're calling the shots, even though we are clearly calling the shots. So we won't ban this rally and we won't ban this speech, but we'll make it damn hard for it to take place. And then we see the people trying to organize the speech, going from room to room, trying to book a hall in which to hold it. And they are told the hall doesn't have its license, the timing isn't right, they've just had a safety check, and though they would love to host this event, the chairs aren't safe, they need to be screwed down, and that would take a week. Oh, you want the event to happen tomorrow night? Sorry, you'll have to postpone, until eventually they do find a pretty miserable and very functional space, just a bare room, essentially, a large bare room. They fill it with chairs, and this is where the talk is going to take place. And then the action moves between two venues, inside the room and outside the room. Inside the room is where people will come to hear this politician give his speech. And we hear the speech in the film. It's a pretty passionate speech, but frankly, it's not a rabble-rousing address. This is not a revolutionary moment. It's a serious speech, but that's not what this is about. This is about the ability to occupy the space, the ability to speak. Many, many more people want to hear this speech than can fit in the room. So it is broadcast outside the room into the square outside. There's a big open public space outside this room. And that's where people gather who can't get into the room. And the people who gather there include the supporters of the politician giving the speech. Many of them are young, men and women. A lot of them look like students. They've got long hair. Some of them are a little scruffy. Some of them are very young indeed. And then a rival group of people who are the ones who want to disrupt the speech. They are pretty thuggish. Some of them look like they might well be paid thugs or hired thugs. They look capable of violence in a way that the students look a little bit capable of fighting back, but they don't quite look as scary as the disruptors do. The disruptors are almost all men. The students and the supporters of this politician are a mixture of men and women. And then another group, all men, the police, who are standing around the edges of this square, in theory keeping the peace, in practice just watching. And so violence breaks out. There are clashes between the rival groups. And there is also violence directed against the politician. As he walks across the square to the venue where he will give his talk, someone runs out of the crowd and smacks him in the head. In front of the police do nothing. The assailant disappears back into the crowd and is never seen again. And the politician falls to the ground and he looks dazed and like he might be very seriously injured. And he's shaken, but he gets up. He's a courageous man. The real Lambrakis was clearly a brave man and an extremely charismatic man as well, as is Yves Montand. And he dusts himself down and he carries on into the hall and he delivers his speech. He looks pretty shaken even while delivering his speech, but he does it. He gets through it. I think we're meant to believe he's probably concussed at this point. But he does it and he comes out. And by the time he comes out, because the speech has been broadcast, the temperature has risen, the political temperature. There is real threat in the air, the threat of a riot, the threat of a real confrontation between the two groups. The police, again, don't seem to be involved. And the politician and his entourage walk across the square. And we get another glimpse of a way in which you can occupy physical space. So one is simply by holding your ground, by fighting them off. If they have sticks, you try and fight back with sticks. If they punch, you punch back. But in this case, the politician does it just with a look. So a group of people, we've seen him be beaten up or at least attacked. And he comes back out into the place where he was attacked. And it's clear other people want to attack him too. And a couple of angry men come out of the crowd, coming towards him. And it's absolutely clear what they have on their minds. And he is effectively defenseless. The police are going to do nothing. By this point, quite a few of the military high brass have shown up as well to watch. This has become a spectacle. What's going to happen, say the people who are there to keep the peace? Nothing to do with us. And Yves Montand, playing this politician, he cowers them with a look. He just shames them with a look. The force of his charisma is almost physical. The men melt away back into the crowd. They're coming for him, and it's like he has a kind of force field around him, and they can't get past it. And so he carries on. And it looks like he's safe. It looks like he's seen off the threat. And then from nowhere, out of the crowd comes not another person, not men armed with sticks on foot, but a vehicle, a sort of pathetic, almost joke-like three-wheel vehicle, a little van, a sort of vegetable or traveling salesman's van, the most unthreatening vehicle you could imagine, but it's a car. And in the occupation of physical space, one thing that we know for sure is that if a car and a human being are trying to occupy the same space and the car is traveling fast and isn't going to stop, the car, the motorized vehicle, will win. And this vehicle comes from nowhere, weaves across the square and just smacks into the politician and knocks him to the ground. We don't really see what happens. It happens very quickly, but there are hundreds, thousands of people watching. So this is a thing that happens in plain view. Everyone sees the event, the incident. They see the man go down, and this time he doesn't get up. And he's carried away in a stretcher. It's chaos. There's a kind of panic in the air, particularly among the people around him. It's not clear, has he been killed? It seems like he's still alive. And eventually he's taken to hospital. That's the first part of the film, leading up to the moment where the three-wheeled vehicle comes out of nowhere and this carefully choreographed event where everyone is in a way playing their part. Everyone seems to know what they're meant to do. There's violence on the edge of it, but it never quite breaks out. And then this explosive event that comes from outside of that choreography. It's a different show the three-wheel vehicle is in. Smack, and the man goes down. And we move on to the second part of the film. And the second part of the film is the aftermath. If the first part of the film is about occupying that space and eventually what happens when a force comes into that space that a single human being cannot withstand, the second part of the film is about attempts to explain what happened. It's about the stories that people tell about this event that has been seen by multiple different witnesses. There's nothing concealed going on here. Thousands of people, certainly hundreds of people, have seen this happen. So in a way, there shouldn't be a mystery, but they've seen something different, or at least even if they haven't seen something different, they are definitely willing to tell a different story. And it is worth saying about other assassinations. So the JFK assassination has a whole insane mystique and conspiracy narrative around it. And it's partly because, though his death happened in plain view, the assassin was not seen. In the case of Bobby Kennedy in 1968, the man who shot him was seen to shoot him by certainly tens of people, possibly even hundreds of people, in a crowded room. Another assassination in plain view with hundreds of witnesses. The story was never straight. People disagreed about almost everything that they saw. Eyewitnesses with a traumatic event like that, they do not see it the same. And in Zed, it's not merely that they don't see it the same, but they have very, very different incentives to tell a different kind of story about this event. The police have a very different incentive from the students. The students have a different incentive from this man's entourage, and so on. And the rest of the film, until near the very end, is an account of the investigation into the assassination. The investigation into the assassination and also the attempts to block or stymie the investigation. So it then stars someone else who's based on a real political figure, the investigating magistrate, who was a Greek man in the real story of the death of Lambrakis, called Christos Tsatsikakis. In this film, he's also played by a French actor who, to me, at any rate, looks very French rather than Greek, because he looks a lot like Yves Saint Laurent, a young Yves Saint Laurent. He has those glasses, that hair. It's like a sort of French fashion mogul has wandered into Greek politics with the job of investigating an assassination. So there's a bit of disconnect there. But this guy's job is to write the report on what happened, and he is under enormous pressure to take the official line. And the official line is, it was an accident. The three-wheeled vehicle was sort of weaving across the square. The person driving it was clearly drunk. This is a case of drunk driving. It's an accident. These things happen. It's very sad. And very early on in the investigation, the phone call comes through, familiar scene in many films. One of the military men, one of the generals, picks up the phone, nods, puts the phone down. He's been told that this is no longer an investigation into someone who's been very gravely injured. The man is dead. And so it becomes even more important to make clear this was not an assassination, this was an accident. And the investigating magistrate, for the most part, feels like he is willing to go along with this, but it's his job, and he's got to at least go through the motions. There's got to be an autopsy. He has got to interview witnesses. So if these people were drunk, he needs to talk to them. Were they drunk? Where had they been drinking? Who had seen them drinking? What were they doing driving this ridiculous car? This car that they themselves call the kamikaze car, because the idea is the only threat that this three-wheeled vehicle is to anyone is the person driving it, because it's such a flimsy piece of machinery. It's a kind of joke, but he needs to look into it. He's got his own professional dignity to think about. And he does. And as he looks into it, the stories don't quite add up. They don't quite come out straight. And the more he looks into it, the more he realizes that the story he's being told is just that, a story. The eyewitnesses are not giving eyewitness accounts. They're giving accounts that they have been primed to give, and so on and so on. It is that familiar story of the investigation uncovering not just the crime, but the cover-up. This all happened in a very distinct Cold War setting. So this is also a Cold War film. Appears in 1969, set in 1963. And it's partly about the way in which the people who are essentially engineering the cover-up, the military men, the generals who are the power behind both right-wing politicians and royalist politicians, indeed the literal throne, the palace in Greece. These men who, on the one hand, would like to portray themselves as ruthless, but also not politicians. They are just soldiers doing their job, which is to protect the state against corruption and infiltration. They think of themselves as straightforward men, but they are completely conflicted. Everything is a kind of double story for them. It is no surprise that they are no good at engineering a cover-up because they haven't got their story straight. They haven't even got their story straight about the Cold War. So the Cold War was a kind of, I want to say, a Greek invention in the sense that the Cold War started when the American president Harry Truman decided to hold the line, to draw a line in Greece against what he saw as creeping communist infiltration. Greece was not going to be the next domino to fall. This is in the late 1940s, and the Truman Doctrine begins with the decision to defend Greece against the communists who then threatened a takeover. That's the start of the Cold War. Greece is on the front line. The question of who occupies Greece and what they're willing to do to hold that line is very, very real. These soldiers are, broadly speaking, on the American side in the Cold War. They are the defenders of Greece as the front line of a conflict against communism, communist infiltration, the threat of left-wing ideas. That's what they are there to protect Greece from. So they are on America's side, and yet all of them, it's clear, are deeply conflicted about this because this is the 1960s. So the timeline gets a bit jumbled up here. The real events are 63. The kind of students that we see in this movie are more like the students of 68. They're long-haired. They've got a sort of hippie vibe to them. At one point, one of the generals says, you know, the slogan that we need to fight against in this country is make love, not war. Basically, we need to replace it with the slogan, you know, we're willing to make war. Make love, not war is a late 60s sort of hippie idea. But the key thing about it is it's also an American idea. This infiltration that they are trying to protect Greece from both is to protect America's influence in that part of the world and to protect Greece from America's cultural and social influence. These people hate the idea of the Americanization of their country, even as they are committed to being Cold Warriors. And there are lots of nice plays on this, including the fact that while this event is taking place, while the speech is being organized and then it happens, then the assassination and the immediate aftermath of the assassination, the other big event in town is that the Bolshoi Ballet have arrived. And at the very beginning of the film, we see one of the generals waving at the Russian ballerinas in the back of a van, smiling at them benignly. Exactly the kind of cultural politics he likes. It's Russian cultural politics. These people have come from the USSR, but it's the Bolshoi. And they're much more comfortable with the Bolshoi Ballet than they are with all of the culture coming out of the United States. They don't know who they are. At the very beginning of the film, they say the reason we will allow this event to take place, though actually we will do everything in our power to suppress it, and it turns out up to and including murdering the man giving the speech, is because we're Democrats. Because they kind of know they're meant to be on the side of democracy against communism, but they're not Democrats, they're fascists. I mean, the mask is a very, very thin and unconvincing one, and behind the mask, it's completely clear who these men in uniform are who are pulling the strings of the state. They are, among other things, anti-Semites. Explicitly in this movie, we get little glimpses of conversations during the investigation when they're trying to suppress the revealing of the truth that behind this assassination was not a drunk driver, but actually a fairly cack-handed but also quite extensive conspiracy involving senior members of the army, the police, and right-wing activists to assassinate this man. When they are trying to cover their tracks and getting increasingly irritated and antsy about the people who are trying to uncover their tracks, of one of those people, one member of the entourage of the man who's been killed, he is condemned by one general to another as a Jew. You know, we can't have this. This man is a Jew. We're not going to let the Jews tell us what to do. And the other general says, it's worse than that. It's not just that he's a Jew, he's a half Jew. And we all know there's only one thing worse than Jews, and that's half Jews. At least Jews know who they are. Half Jews pretend to be something else. These people are anti-Semites. But it leads to another exquisite moment in this movie, of which there are many, a beautifully captured irony, almost in passing, quite near the end of the film, as the conspiracy is uncovered and the magistrate digs and finds that actually quite a lot of these senior military men knew all about what was going to happen on that night and were involved in the cover-up. He manages to arrest a number of them, and he makes sure to parade them as they are being taken to be interviewed in front of the press. And then he makes sure that when they leave the interview, they think they're going out the back way, but they have to run the gauntlet of the journalists again, who ask them, why are you here? What are you being accused of? Why have you been arrested? What have you done? And at one point, when one of the most senior of these military men comes out of his interrogation, one of the journalists comes up to him and says, are you innocent? Are you Dreyfus? Like, are you another example of a military man, the Dreyfus affair? In late 19th century, early 20th century France, the most celebrated case of a military man accused of crimes against the state who turned out to be innocent and the victim of persecution. And so in a slightly mocking way, this journalist says to this fearsome, humorless, sour-faced looking general, General, you've been arrested. Are you the Dreyfus of our time? And the general looks baffled and confused and furious because he's being invited to say, yes, I am Dreyfus, I'm innocent. But he can't say that because he's an anti-Semite and he still believes that Dreyfus the Jew was guilty. And so his answer to the question, are you Dreyfus, is a furious, but Dreyfus was guilty. These men cannot get their stories straight about anything. Unlike the people who are investigating them, who to start with are not all that keen to uncover the truth. But the trouble is, the true story keeps asserting itself because it's consistent. It's consistent with what they discover. The problem with the generals is that they are consistent in a completely different way. As always, it's not the conspiracy, it's the cover-up that gets them. And in this case, one of the hopeless ways in which they try and cover their tracks is they agree lines to take under interview. They've already told the lower down ranks of the conspiracy, including the men who it turns out didn't drive into the politician and run him over, but as passing him, whacked him over the head with a stick and bashed his brains out, which the autopsy reveals. One of the things that the investigation cannot avoid is the fact that the doctors, who are simply reporting what they see on their x-rays and their scans, say this man didn't die by being hit by a vehicle and crashing his head into the pavement or a paving stone. His wounds are consistent with his having been beaten around the head with a heavy object wielded by another human being. The people who did the beating are given lines to take, and they make the classic mistake. They are too close to each other. They use the same words, the same terms, which makes everybody suspicious. In these interviews, the interrogators find themselves hearing exactly the same story. And then it happens again with the colonels and the generals. One by one, they're brought in and they're asked, were you involved in this? Explain this document, explain that document, explain the timeline, explain why the timeline doesn't match your original account of events. And they puff themselves up, these men. And the first time you see it, you almost believe it. The first one who's interrogated, he puffs himself up and he says, this is an outrage. And if you impugn my honor in this way, I am a military man, I will have no choice but to kill myself. Right? It's intolerable for me to have my honor questioned. And a soldier like me, I will have to put a bullet in my head. Dishonor is suicide. And you think, well, that's powerful stuff. It's a bit cheesy and implausible. And the interrogating magistrate looks a little taken aback. Then the next one comes in and he says, this is an outrage. You are impugning my honor. And if you carry on in this way, I am a military man of honor and I will have no choice but to kill myself. And that time, the investigating magistrate merely nods. And then the third one comes in and he says exactly the same in the same form of words. And at this point, the investigating magistrate smiles and he knows that he's got them. This is a film that has some echoes of the JFK assassination, not because of the wild kinds of conspiracy theories that erupted around that event almost as soon as it happened, and not because of those kinds of conspiracy theories that implicate everyone from the mafia to the Russians to the deep American state and so on. In this film, the conspiracy is pretty damn prosaic. It is generals who have either with a nod and a wink or a little lower down the ranks with something a bit more explicit, including threats and bribes. The people who do the deed are drawn into it by the most prosaic offers. This is a corrupt state, a relatively corrupt state, in which a lot depends on who you know. Most of the people who are the ones who want to attack or break up or antagonize the leftists, the students, the peaceniks, they are working men, working class men, or lower middle class men with their own businesses, small businesses. They sell fruit, they run little shops. One of them is a carpenter, so on and so on. These are working men. And being a working man, we're meant to understand in this country, the one that we are being shown here, is hard because you need a license and a permit and a this and a that. And these are the things they're tempted with. You do this deed and you'll never have to pay anyone a bribe for a license or a permit again. You'll get a permanent permit. We will give you the trade that you need. It's small scale stuff. This is not a grand conspiracy. People are weak and easily bought. And the people who buy them are pretty weak too, and they're not particularly good at covering their tracks. So it's not that kind of conspiracy. The magistrate doesn't have to dig that far for the whole thing to fall apart. The echoes of JFK are actually in the one really significant woman character in the film, female character in the film, who is the wife and then the widow of the Lambrakis politician. She happens, in this case, to be one of the few actors in the film who is Greek. It's Irene Papas, a celebrated Greek film star. She plays the wife, the widow, very passionately. It's a very soulful performance. She is haunted. She doesn't have much to say. She is grieving and mourning. They were clearly a very glamorous couple. She arrives when the news of the attack reaches her. She's not with her husband. And she's immediately interrogated by the press, who start questioning her because, as they say to her, as she walks into the hospital to find the news of her husband, one of the questions that's thrown at her by a journalist is, were you the perfect couple? Are you the perfect couple? Are you as good as you seem? Your husband, glamorous, charismatic, sports star, member of parliament, hero of the young, and you, beautiful, his beautiful wife, enigmatic. You seem perfect. What's going on here? It has echoes not of JFK and Lee Harvey Oswald and everything that goes around that, but JFK and Jackie Kennedy. And of course, in one of those weirdnesses, Jackie Kennedy becomes Jackie Onassis. She marries the richest Greek man in the world. In this film, the character played by Irene Papas has echoes of Jackie Kennedy. She is enigmatic, and we are led to believe that they are not the perfect couple. We are just given glimpses in this film of the thought that this politician is not a saint. He is a womanizer. We get just a little glimpse. We don't see much, just a glimpse of the fact that when he's on the campaign trail, he probably has a roving eye and more than just a roving eye. And she is both heartbroken, completely heartbroken, of course, by her husband's death, but one feels there was a previous sadness there. As he faces death, it also becomes clear that he can't bear to leave his wife. There is also real love there. It's a real relationship. It is a complicated relationship. It is beautifully conveyed that there is something grown up going on here, which the press can't understand, which the politics will misrepresent. She will be the grieving widow. She will be idolized, but also trivialized. Her grief will be trivialized. It's all appearance. The appearance of grief becomes the grief. And she has almost nothing to say in this film. She conveys that there is a story behind the story because there's always a story behind the story. All the way throughout the investigation, it is a contest between the desire to uncover the truth of that marriage, the truth of that relationship, the truth of the politician's ambitions, but also the truth of what actually happened to him, the truth of the connivance of the police, the truth of the involvement of the senior members of the military. There are real truths here. This isn't some kind of relativist film which says that the truth is whatever you say it is. And yet it also makes clear the truth has to be said by someone. And as soon as it is said by someone, it just becomes another story. And one of the dilemmas for the grief-stricken entourage, the close comrades and supporters of the politician who's been killed, his advisors, his speechwriters, and so on, they want to uncover the truth too. But they also know that screaming conspiracy, screaming assassination is exactly the story that everyone expects of them. They expect them to say he was assassinated, the military are involved, and therefore they won't be believed. It is one of the classic dilemmas of politics and of life, that often if the story is one that bears out your suspicions and the story is true, the fact that it is seen to bear out your suspicions means that people won't believe it because they'll say, you would say that, wouldn't you? And alongside the magistrate, the other key figure in uncovering the conspiracy is a young journalist, a photojournalist, who we see throughout the film. He's digging. He wants to know what's going on. He wants to make a name for himself. He's a bit of a hip young gunslinger. He's another womanizer. You wouldn't trust him an inch, this guy. But he is dogged and he's brave. And he wants to follow the evidence where it takes him. And it takes him to find some of the people involved, to risk physical injury by going into the places where people like him tend to be beaten up, young men with long hair and cameras. He shoots from the hip in the sense that he literally has his camera by his hip and he's clicking without the people he's talking to being aware of it. He is both a forerunner of a much better known, I suppose now, film about investigating a conspiracy, All the President's Men. He is a heroic journalist in that mold. A million miles from being a saint, as Bernstein and Woodward were a million miles from being saints, but dogged and determined and of that era. But he's also a little bit of an echo of a film that had only come out a couple of years earlier, another emblematic film of the late 1960s, Antonioni's Blow Up, the film starring David Hemmings as the young hip photographer who takes pictures and through taking pictures uncovers mysteries. Things are not what they seem. If photography is meant to be the revealing of the truth, it turns out that taking photographs can just obscure the truth. It can catch things that people don't want to be caught, but for that very reason, no one will believe that the photograph is what it seems to be, and so on. He's a version of that kind of journalist, that kind of gunslinger too. But it works. In this case, there isn't really a mystery. In the second part of the film, the dogged magistrate who looks like Yves Saint Laurent and the young, hip photographer who could be showing up from a little fashion shoot on Carnaby Street, that guy, between them, they discover that witnesses have been bullied, that lies have been told, that the autopsy was being countered with what one of the conspirators calls, in a very unfortunate phrase, the counter-autopsy. When he's told that the autopsy says that he wasn't run down by the three-wheeler, he was beaten over the head. This general says, well, let's have a counter-autopsy then. Why should that autopsy be allowed to be the truth? Even an autopsy is just another story. But they dig, and the conspiracy just reveals itself. It can't be hidden because these people are incompetents. They don't really know who they are. They don't really know what their story is. They've almost half persuaded themselves they weren't involved. They almost believe their lines when they say their honor has been impugned. And so one by one, they get taken down. And it is a film which seems to be heading towards, if you like, the truth to out, particularly the truth about a conspiracy that leads to an assassination and then the cover-up that attempts to conceal what really went on. If you like that to be exposed, a bit like in All the President's Men, it looks like we're heading towards a kind of cathartic moment of truth. And as we get very near the end, we are told that these people went to jail. They lost their jobs. The courts, which in many ways were under the thumb of the military at this point in Greece. I mean, this conspiracy is wide and it's deep, but they couldn't resist the truth. The evidence that this happened was impossible in the end to argue with. And it's partly because actually the people who end up exposing it are not ideologues. They are not part of the left. It is not his entourage. At one point, when it's clear that they have the evidence, the politician who's been killed, one member of his team excitedly says, we must publish this in our newspaper, in our leftist newspaper. We must tell our people that their man was killed. We must let the truth out and let our people know. And the photojournalist says, don't be crazy. If you publish it in your paper, no one will believe you. They'll just think it's more left-wing propaganda. Publish it in my paper, my mainstream, sort of pretty establishment paper. Then people will believe it. The magistrate is not a leftist. He doesn't have an axe to grind. He looks like he is comfortable serving the regime. And for that reason, he's the perfect person to expose the crime. And so the crime is exposed. The real story wins out. And there are only 2 or 3 minutes of the film left to go. So what else is there to say? What else there is to say is what happens in the final sequences of the movie, the third version of politics. At the very end of the film, we are told what really happened. That is, what really happened after what really happened had been exposed. There were trials, and this is the real story of what happened in Greece, but a number of the witnesses were murdered before they could come to trial. The perpetrators were indeed jailed, including some policemen, but the military men, the leading military men, were merely given administrative reprimands. The government did fall, and the politicians' party believed that with the truth coming out, the government would fall, would be swept away, the right-wing government. A new democratic movement would take over in Greece, and that this exposing of the truth would lead to the true democracy that they believed Greece craved, including a democracy that could then answer to the people's desire for peace and for a different kind of politics in the Cold War, all of that. And as we're told right at the end of the film, not only did none of that happen, but actually, in the end, the military simply took over. They did get their story straight, and their story was, this isn't a democracy. And that is what happened in Greece. In 1967, there was a military coup, the coup of the colonels, as it was called. And it was a good old-fashioned military coup. They went on TV and played martial music and announced that the rule of law had been suspended and replaced with martial law, and that people should remain in their homes, and there would be curfews, and all protest would be banned, and the country would now have military discipline as its governing philosophy. In 1969, when this film came out, the colonels were still in charge in Greece. And the film ends with a list of the things that the colonels had banned in Greece. Behind the physical force that is the first part of the film, we get, in the last 2/3 of the film, the story of the stories that people try and tell about a physical event, to make sense of it, to tell the truth about it. And in that part of the film, the truth comes out. But at the very end of the film, in an unbelievably bleak final 30 seconds, we are told that it just didn't matter. In fact, the effect of telling the truth was not that the truth won, but that the truth was suppressed by a far more brutal form of physical force, of occupying the space, the occupation of the space that is a military coup. Generals in TV studios telling the public to stay at home and suspending the rule of law, the freedom of the press. But not just that. The list of the things that were banned in Greece, as we're told at the end of the film, we're not told it's Greece, we're just meant to intuit that, but we know what they're talking about. It includes all sorts of things, including long hair. And there's a great scene late on in the film following the assassination where a group of students, of young activists on the streets, are trying to rouse the people to protest against the assassination of the politician, and the police come in to break up their protest. And as so often in late 1960s protests, the police brutality is extreme. These young people are dragged off by their hair, by their clothes. But they're not thrown into the back of police vans, and they're not beaten over the heads with sticks. They are physically held down and their hair is cut. One of the things that the colonels banned was long hair, but also they suppressed, as we're told at the end of the film, Tolstoy and Sophocles and Sartre and Ionesco and Pinter and sociology and pop music and radical mathematics. They ban all stories other than their own. So behind physical force is storytelling, this film tells us. And at the end of the film, we discover that behind the storytelling is just more physical force. That's where the film ends, but that is not where the story ends. In 1969, that's where the story had been parked for now. But the colonels only lasted 7 years, and then they were gone. And a student uprising, among other things, did for them. There was one student protest in the end that they couldn't suppress. And they fell. And Greece took quick, tentative but quick steps to becoming a democracy, a recognizable democracy in the thin modern sense, nothing too ancient Greek about it, but still a democracy like the ones that existed in Western Europe, still on the front line of the Cold War, still a country full of division and contention and anger and some violence, but no longer subject to a military dictatorship, free, or at least freer. And in that new democracy, the people who had exposed the truth of the assassination, the real assassination of Lambrakis, who had helped to bring down the government, but in so doing had helped to bring about a military coup. And as a result of the military coup, among other people, the magistrate lost his job. And many of those who'd been involved in exposing the conspiracy were either jailed or in some cases died under suspicious circumstances, fell from buildings, or died during police interrogation. But those who survived the colonels, they weren't just rehabilitated, they came back to play a leading role in Greek politics, including the prosecutor, Tsatsatakis, who became a leading Greek politician and indeed a senator. But the other person who continued to play a role in Greek politics was Lambrakis. The reason that the film is called Z is that following his death, the slogan of his supporters that they painted on streets and on the sides of buildings was the letter Z, because it stands for the Greek term for he lives. He is dead, but he lives on. And that was the spark for what they hoped would be the movement that would bring the end of military and oppressive rule in Greece and a new democracy in the spirit of Lambrakis. The very final thing at the end of the film that we are told that the colonels banned, along with Pinter and pop music and everything else, was the use of the letter Z for political purposes. The Z slogan would be banned. No more painting it on roads or buildings. No more expressing Z. They ban the letter Z. And then they fall, and the letter Z is still intact and is still going. And indeed, Lambrakis' reputation grew and grew, and he became a symbol in 1980s Greece, still Cold War Greece, but 1980s Greece, of peace movements, student movements, left-wing activism, of a new kind of democracy. So if you carry the story on beyond the end of the film, you get another version of politics. First of all, there's physical force. Then there is the story that overlays the force, but also explains the force. Then there is the force that suppresses the story. And then there is the story that reemerges in the aftermath of the suppression by the force. And where does it go from there? By the time you've got the fourth turning of the wheel, what I think you have to assume what connects these different versions of politics is that none of them is ever fixed. Behind physical force, the occupation of space, violence in politics, there is always storytelling to secure the legitimacy of the use of whatever force has been used, of the occupancy of the benches, of the space, of the chamber, of the floor, of whatever it is, of the square, the town square, the various squares around the world where popular uprisings happen and are suppressed. Tiananmen Square, Tahrir Square. There is always a story to be told about the occupation of space. And there is always behind that story the attempt to deploy force in order to uphold the story. And there is always a story to be told about that attempt to deploy force and so on. Behind physicality in politics, there is storytelling. And behind storytelling in politics, there is physicality. And no film that I have ever seen has ever conveyed that to me as powerfully as Zed. Before I tell you about what's coming up next in this series, I hope you'll forgive me for just a tiny bit of podcast housekeeping. We've been delighted that so many people have signed up for our Christmas gift offer. If you have purchased this gift package, we have sent you an email asking for the address you'd like the book to be sent to, and also what inscription you'd like me to write in the book. If you had this email and haven't replied, and we have still to hear from quite a few people, do please reply to it. And if you think you haven't got this email, do please check your junk, because we are very keen to get these gifts to people in time for Christmas. The gift package is now closed, I'm afraid, for people overseas, because we won't be able to get it to you for Christmas. There are a few days left if you're in the UK and you would like to purchase it. But just a reminder, if you would like to give people a Christmas gift that doesn't include the book, you can sign them up to PPF Plus anytime, right up until Christmas Eve and beyond. Coming up next on The Great Political Films, it's a conversation. I am talking to the very distinguished former politician Chris Smith, a member of Tony Blair's government, about his favourite political film, and a film that is fascinating about what it means to be a campaigning politician. It came out in 1972. It stars Robert Redford. It is The Candidate with Chris Smith. Next time, do join me for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.